Well, there's always a system, but can there be a structure? But there's also a very important reason for the United States in that. We will be involved in Middle East security, deeply engaged, for as long as anybody in this room is alive. That is a foregone conclusion. The people who would argue that the United States will leave the Middle East, that's nonsense. It also gets to the question about, you used the term, Kate, of Iran's hegemonic ambitions. Nobody else in the Middle East is going to be hegemonic unless the United States decides to leave, and we're not going to. But, very important but, as the American people look out to the Middle East, I would argue that the tolerance for the degree of engagement we have today is not unlimited. Hence, when it came to looking at the future of Iraq, the United States withdrawal from Iraq is a timeline-based withdrawal of American forces, not a conditions-based withdrawal. Afghanistan is the opposite. The President set conditions under which we will withdraw, but not a timetable except for beginning. Question: can something be created in the region that will enable the United States to fulfill its interests, which will be continuing, at lower cost in blood, treasure, and in opportunity costs? One might argue, in fact, that we have, and you take the largest perspective of American national security policy, we probably should be spending a lot more time in East Asia with regard to China, South Asia, with regard to India. And in fact, it is sometimes argued that the $1 trillion that we've spent now in the last decade on the Middle East, which we did, let's say, for good and sufficient reason, is not necessarily the best investment for the future. So, is it possible to create some kind of structure in the region which will enable the United States to fulfill its interests in other countries and entities to fulfill their interests at lower cost in blood, treasure, and in opportunity cost? In my study, I look at 7 different issues. The future of Iraq. To what extent is the way the Iraq endgame comes about, and I'm talking about endgame in terms of our direct military engagement, clearly not an endgame in terms of the evolution of Iraq, so that that will contribute to a more secure region rather than be a constant source of concern. There are some countries that may be worried more about Iran today, but could very well be more worried about Iraq tomorrow. What do we do between now and then? So this is a positive rather than negative development. The role of Iran, obviously. If you're going to develop a strategic, a security framework, you have to look at two cases. One, where Iran might be a participant at some point. And let us note that the Iranians have already talked about a regional security structure, which sounds a lot like what a lot of people in the West are talking about, but with a major exception. For the Iranians, that's great, except America do not apply. The West do not apply. Frankly, that's not going to happen. But at least they're showing some kind of understanding that an open-ended anarchic situation is not necessarily in Iran's long-term interest. Not necessarily. The other circumstance is in which Iran remains outside as a hostile power, attempting to break apart whatever efforts there are to have a security structure that might work for everybody else. And the intermediate question is, do you create something, try to create something, and then leave an empty chair for the Iranians if they are prepared to play by the rules adopted by everybody else? Something to be tested. Number 3, of course, is the question of asymmetrical threats, which are rising in the region of which terrorism is number 1, but it is not necessarily alone. The whole questions of insurgencies and the like. All of these countries are in one way or another, as is the United States and the rest of the Western world, facing asymmetrical threats from the region. And if you're going to have a successful security structure, you have to find a way to account and deal with them. 4th point is, how do you give people in the region confidence that if they were to make the choices that I am implying would have to be made, that they find this congenial? What kind of security reassurances will there be, and where do they come from? How many can come from within the region? Well, we're seeing now, for example, the new arms sales to Saudi Arabia and to other countries. Will these help countries become reassured about the future of their security, or in fact, might they make, in some regards, matters worse? a debate we've been having now for about 30 years. And what about the outside world, in particular the United States? What reassurances are we prepared to give in regard to Iran, but maybe more generally? After all, some time ago, 1990-91, it was Iraq. 2003, it was Iraq. Now it's Iran. Maybe it'll be somebody else in the future, particularly because nobody can be confident about the nature of governments and regimes in the region for the future. We have already talked, as the Secretary of State did last summer, when she was at an ASEAN conference, about the United States possibly giving reassurances that might even come to formal guarantees and formal commitments ratified by the Congress, potentially with an extension of what used to be called extended deterrence, the implication that there might be nuclear weapons in the background. I'm not arguing in favor of that, but in terms of regional reassurance to local countries that would not feel confident and secure in their own, even with a structure, it's something that we have to think about. But it could well be for the United States that doing that is going to be cheaper in terms of blood, treasure, and opportunity costs than our having an open-ended engagement of U.S. military and other kinds of power without some effort to create some kind of structure. The Arab-Israeli conflict. Obviously, you cannot consider what else is happening in the region without taking that into account. One of the questions, however, and I'm going to pose that despite the current commitments of the United States, is how important is it in reality that Arab-Israeli peacemaking, particularly Israel and Palestinians, move forward to some kind of decisive, equitable, successful point in order to be able to have security elsewhere in the region and U.S. interests be fulfilled. If you deal with the Europeans, who always want us to do that, I think that blue smoke and mirrors is going to be enough. But I'll leave to the experts here or to others to tell me your view about how important is it that the current process that's underway actually succeed. And what does success mean in order for us to be able to do other things? You talked about Steve Barakat supposed to come here for lunch. You said unless something has happened in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, I'd be prepared to pay my down payment now on the lunch that you will be taking part in. In addition to what I said about the Iranian thing, I don't think anything can possibly be done so long as the Gaza situation remains the way it is today. And until, oh, it's still showing now, okay. And until in which the Israeli people get more confidence about the future of their security than appears in the economy. There's also the issue of regional tensions. The idea that this is just Iran out there beggars history, both looking backwards, where it was Iraq, and looking forward, relations among different countries, whether it's Bahrain and different neighbors, whether it's Qatar and Saudi Arabia, whether it's what's happening in Yemen. The security structure also has to be looking at relations among countries, so that even if they wanted to coalesce against a single other like Iran, they would have some kind of mechanism for dealing with their own problems, so they would say, we are prepared to coalesce on something that